What if the most powerful weapon of war was not a rifle, a shell, or even an army, but the ability to make people disappear without killing them? In 1916, during the height of the First World War, the British state faced a terrifying challenge: how to maintain public support while managing the enormous human cost of modern warfare. The solution was not simply fought on battlefields. It was fought in courtrooms, hospitals, newspapers, and even in the landscape itself. Men who refused to fight were quietly removed from public life. Horrific injuries were hidden from view. Information was carefully controlled. And sometimes, invisibility became a deliberate strategy. Erasure of dissent. In 1916, imagine waking up and realizing the state has deleted your right to exist on your own terms. You might think your greatest threat was an enemy bullet, but in January 1916, a different threat emerged when the British government passed the Military Service Act. Overnight, this legislation transformed a proud tradition of a volunteer army into a compulsory machine. The government did not just want bodies for the front lines. They needed absolute ideological compliance. The resulting tribunal system was not about justice. It was a calculated institutional mechanism designed to completely erase dissenters from the public eye and render their objections invisible. To enforce this mandate, the state established a bureaucratic apparatus consisting of 3 tiers. Men who resisted conscription first faced the local tribunal, held in town halls, presided over by local employers and a stern military representative. If rejected, they escalated to regional bodies, like the West Kent Appeal Tribunal, and finally, the Central Tribunal in London, whose decisions were absolute law. Standing before these panels, a man faced a barrage of 13 specific questions engineered to trap him and test his convictions. The authorities categorized these men into 3 main groups, though the lines were deliberately blurred. Absolutists completely rejected any state authority over their lives. Alternativists offered to do national work like agriculture, as long as it was strictly civilian. Non-combatants agreed to join the military structure, but flatly refused to carry weapons, often being funneled into the non-combatant corps. This rigid sorting system often created the very radicalism it sought to suppress. Consider the story of Malcolm Sparks, standing before the tribunal at Slough. He was an eager alternativist, fully willing to perform non-military service to support his country. Yet, the local tribunal bluntly refused to grant an exemption that respected his specific moral boundaries. By rejecting his compromise, the state effectively radicalized a willing worker, forcing him into a reluctant absolutist position and transforming a cooperative citizen into an invisible criminal locked away within the sprawling prison system. The military then escalated tactics to terrifying extremes, illustrated by the harrowing ordeal of the Richmond 16. This group of absolutists included Norman Gaudy, a Sunderland footballer, and schoolteacher John Hubert Brocklesby. Detained at Richmond Castle in North Yorkshire, these 16 men faced a brutal legal loophole. In May 1916, authorities forcibly transported them to France. This deliberate maneuver bypassed the civilian legal protections of the tribunal system to place the men directly under the harsh jurisdiction of the Army Act. In France, the men refused to move military supplies. They were swiftly court-martialed in front of a massive crowd of troops to make a public example of their defiance. The sentence for all 16 men was death by shooting. General Haig eventually commuted these executions to 10 years of penal servitude, but the psychological damage was done. The desperate graffiti they carved into the walls of Richmond Castle remains today, a haunting artifact of human identity the state tried erasing. While the military crushed dissent through the courts, a different kind of erasure happened on the civilian front, through devastating social invisibility. Started by Admiral Charles Penrose Fitzgerald, the White Feather Campaign gained vicious traction in 1916, becoming a societal weapon. This movement weaponized intense gendered propaganda, organizing women to publicly hand out white feathers to any man found wearing civilian clothes. Derived from cockfighting, the feather was a symbol of cowardice. The goal was to publicly humiliate and emasculate men into enlisting, ignoring whether they were medically unfit, in reserved occupations, or wounded veterans on leave. This relentless public shaming created a suffocating visual anxiety across Britain. The severe harassment led to heartbreaking tragedies, such as the suicide of Robert Greaves, who took his life after receiving a feather despite being entirely unfit for service. The chaos caused by this indiscriminate civilian witch hunt eventually forced the government to intervene with a desperate physical fix. By September 1916, the state introduced the Silver War Badge. Discharged and wounded veterans were required to pin this small piece of metal to their lapels just to safely walk down the street. A man who sacrificed his body for the empire now needed a physical token just to be seen as a patriot and avoid vicious harassment. The badge proved that in the highly paranoid atmosphere of 1916 Britain, your character and your past did not matter at all. If you lacked the proper visual uniform, your legitimate existence was entirely invisible, hiding the scars of war. Think about what happens when the machinery of war destroys the primary site of human identity. Mechanized warfare did not just break bodies on the battlefield. Heavy artillery and high-velocity shrapnel in the close proximity of trenches ripped faces off entirely. Society was completely unprepared for this bodily destruction. We will explore how an inability to look at its own devastation forced a medical revolution. This revolution was not just about healing soldiers. It was designed to hide the horrific reality of the trenches from the civilian public at home. The facially wounded veteran became a figure of profound social invisibility, forced into the shadows by a public that simply could not bear to look at the true cost of their conflict. The sheer volume of these devastating injuries necessitated a completely new approach to medicine. In 1915, a New Zealand-born otolaryngologist named Harold Gillies witnessed this catastrophic rise in severe facial wounds while serving in France. He realized that traditional field medicine was inadequate for injuries that stripped away a person's humanity. Driven by this crisis, Gillies successfully pushed the British military to establish a dedicated facial injury ward at the Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot. This was the birth of modern reconstructive surgery. Gillies understood that restoring a face was about restoring a human being to society, so they might lead a normal life. He assembled a multidisciplinary team of surgeons, dentists, and artists to rebuild what the war had obliterated. A critical medical breakthrough arrived in 1916 during the treatment of Willie Vicarage, a sailor who suffered severe burns at the Battle of Jutland. The flames had left Vicarage with a fixed, scarred mask, leaving him entirely unable to even close his eyes or his mouth. To save Vicarage from this condition, Gillies pioneered two revolutionary techniques known as the tubed pedicle and the Masonic collar flap. By stitching a skin flap from the chest or forehead into a tube, Gillies maintained the vital blood supply and reduced the risk of deadly infections. He then grafted this tissue to the lower face to restore basic jaw and chin functionality. The overwhelming demand for these complex procedures led directly to the June 1917 opening of Queen's Hospital at Sidcup, which became the first hospital entirely dedicated to treating facial injuries. Surgery, however, had its limits. For soldiers whose facial bone structure was too shattered for Gillies to repair, a different kind of restoration was required. At the 3rd London General Hospital, a sculptor named Captain Francis Derwent Wood offered visibility through the art of prosthetics. He ran a specialized facility widely known as the Tin Noses Shop. Wood and his artistic team undertook a painstaking process to craft portrait masks for the most severely disfigured veterans. They would start by taking a plaster cast of the patient's wounded face. Then, relying on pre-war photographs provided by the family, they sculpted a precise reconstruction of the missing features. They used this sculpture to fashion a thin copper mask, galvanized it with pure silver, and meticulously hand-painted the metal to perfectly match the exact skin tone of the patient. These masks were incredibly intimate objects that attempted to realign a broken appearance with a lost identity. Yet they also highlight the psychological horror of a pervasive culture of aversion that swept through wartime Britain. The public harbored a deep-seated anxiety and collective urge to look away from the facially disfigured. Unlike amputees who were often celebrated as brave heroes, men with facial wounds were hidden away. Inside the specialized isolation wards, staff deliberately withheld mirrors from the patients to prevent them from seeing their own reflections and internalizing the severity of their trauma. Outside the hospital at Sidcup, the local town benches where patients sat were painted a bright blue. This served as a visual warning for local townspeople to avert their eyes and avoid being shocked. The psychological toll was so immense that many veterans felt alienated, refusing to see their own families or fiancés. They would only venture outside, into the world under the protective cover of absolute darkness, to avoid the horrified stares of the public. Ultimately, the meticulous surgical reconstruction and the crafting of lifelike metal masks were as much a political act of civilian suppression as they were about medical healing. The state needed to censor the raw, visible trauma of the war to maintain morale, ensuring the most brutal consequences of combat remained invisible. The architecture of artificial reality. You have been lied to about the scale of the First World War. This deception did not start with modern history books. It was engineered by the very people who lived it. By 1916, the British government realized a terrifying truth. If the public actually saw the unprecedented slaughter happening across the Channel, the entire war machine would collapse overnight. To prevent this, the state deployed the British Press Bureau, acting as the ultimate architect of a managed artificial reality. This secretive government entity was designed specifically to hide the greatest slaughter in military history in plain sight. They operated with a rigidity of prohibition that controlled every single piece of information reaching the home front. They dictated exactly what the public was allowed to know and heavily punished anyone attempting to break the illusion. Consider the sinking of HMS Pathfinder. The Press Bureau completely suppressed all specific details of the location and the horrific nature of the disaster. They forced compliant newspapers like The Scotsman to publish entirely colorless and vague official reports. Meanwhile, the state ruthlessly targeted and punished any independent journalists who tried to bypass the censor and publish truthful eyewitness accounts of the devastation. This created a highly fragmented information landscape where the truth was only visible to those willing to risk severe legal repercussions. This system of institutionalized deception reached its most extreme peak during the reporting of the Battle of the Somme, which began in July 1916. The first day of this offensive represents the greatest loss of life in a single day in the entire history of the British Army. In just 24 hours, the British suffered approximately 60,000 casualties, leaving 19,240 men dead in the mud. Yet the official narrative pumped out to the public rendered this apocalyptic disaster entirely invisible. Sir Douglas Haig deliberately submitted fabricated reports, claiming the initial 40,000 casualties could not be considered severe. He even told the public the overall situation was quite satisfactory. War correspondents were heavily restricted by censors and essentially forced into complicity. The Daily Chronicle shamelessly reported that casualties were not heavy, while government officials in London claimed the enemy was flying back in absolute disorder. The obscuration continued deep into September, when 2,000 New Zealanders died in entirely fruitless attempts to advance. The state media simply framed this massacre as a series of vigorous attacks, resulting in fruitful gains. This systematic cover-up had a chilling effect on the population. It created a massive psychological divide between the civilians at home and the soldiers bleeding out in the trenches. The men fighting quickly realized the press was a deceitful force, publishing ridiculous accounts that completely contradicted their daily reality. But the government knew that controlling the newspapers was only half the battle. To maintain the illusion, they had to implement micro-level suppression directly on the front lines through strict field censorship. This sweeping censorship extended to the private correspondence of millions of soldiers. The military enforced a brutal one-letter-a-week, one-page-only rule. This forced men to condense their entire existence into a tiny, state-approved space. Furthermore, military officers were strictly required to read every single letter and strike out any unapproved reality with thick black ink. This was officially justified as a way to prevent sensitive, tactical information from falling into enemy hands. However, the true practical effect was sanitizing the traumatic experience of the soldier for his family back home. The brutal realities of trench warfare were methodically scrubbed clean before the mail ever reached civilian soil. Soldiers desperate to communicate their actual living conditions had to become incredibly inventive. Men like Monty Cleave developed elaborate ways of getting around the censors, smuggling hidden messages to their loved ones. They had to invent codes to share the truth about the creeping horrors of the battlefield. The insidious nature of new weapons like poison gas remained a largely unspoken terror in the domestic sphere because the state refused to let soldiers write about their burning lungs. This domestic censorship ensured that the creeping dangers of the front line remained entirely unseen and completely unacknowledged by the public. The home front was intentionally blinded, left to cheer for an artificial war that did not exist. By erasing the visible truth of the individual soldier, the British government built a towering monument to military success on a foundation of deliberate, institutionalized lies. The masterful art of illusion. If you want to survive the absolute apocalypse of modern combat, you have to become a ghost. By 1916, the art of vanishing stopped being a simple parlor trick and rapidly became the most lethal weapon on the Western Front. We are going to track the literal, physical application of invisibility during this brutal conflict. This was not about hiding in the shadows. It was about turning the completely shattered, cratered mud of Europe into a massive, deadly optical illusion. When armies possess eyes in the sky and constant aerial reconnaissance, the very act of being seen guarantees your destruction. Survival demanded that soldiers, weapons, and entire observation networks seamlessly blend into the barren wasteland. This desperate need for concealment brought an incredibly unlikely figure into the heart of the British military machine. Meet Solomon J. Solomon, a highly renowned Royal Academician and master painter. While generals obsessed over artillery calibers and troop movements, Solomon understood that modern warfare required a completely different type of visual genius. In January 1915, he penned a passionate letter to the Times, advocating that the army desperately needed to learn from the natural world around them. He argued that harnessing biological adaptations like color assimilation was a critical modern strategy. The military brass eventually realized the eccentric painter was absolutely right. The sprawling, muddy trenches required the meticulous eye of a trained artist to deceive the increasingly sophisticated enemy observers looking down from above. By March of 1916, the British Army fully embraced this artistic warfare by establishing a highly secretive new unit. They operated under the deceptively boring name of the Special Works Park. This intensely mundane title was deliberately chosen by commanders to mask its true, groundbreaking purpose as the official British camouflage section. Solomon received the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel and immediately set up a camouflage school right in the middle of Kensington Gardens. He did not recruit standard soldiers for this top-secret facility. Instead, he assembled a highly diverse, unconventional team of eccentric theater professionals, theatrical scenery painters, and visionary stage set designers. Together, this bizarre collection of artists turned the Royal Park into a sprawling laboratory dedicated to the science of military deception. The absolute masterpiece of this unit was the unbelievable nocturnal engineering of the camouflage. Observation tree. In the completely static, violently denuded landscapes of the Western Front, Blast-shattered trees were often the only tall vertical features left standing above ground level. In order to see without being seen, the artists invented a flawless sculptural mimesis. A military artist, such as the daring scout Leon Underwood, would literally crawl out into the mud of no man's land under the cover of absolute darkness. His mission was to sketch a specific, strategically located dead tree from the precise viewpoint of the opposing enemy trenches. Back in a sheltered military workshop, engineers used these sketches to build a hollow replica featuring a heavy, armor-plated steel core. The exterior of this steel tube was carefully clad with materials like thin sheet iron, reinforced plaster, and expertly painted canvas. The artists meticulously recreated the shattered bark, the jagged bullet holes, and the dried mud splashes of the original tree. Under the cover of night, often masked by a deliberate, deafening artillery bombardment to hide the heavy mechanical noise, engineers would cut down the real tree and rapidly bolt the fake replica into its exact place. The very first British observation tree was successfully erected on March 11, 1916, near the battlefield at Ypres. In a stunning display of royal support, this specific tree utilized actual willow bark harvested directly from Windsor Great Park, secured with the personal permission of King George V. The observation trees were just the beginning of a much broader arsenal of deception. As the months dragged on, the application of camouflage expanded rapidly to shield the entire machinery of war. Miles upon miles of complex camouflage netting were painstakingly woven by hundreds of French women and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. These massive nets magically shielded enormous artillery batteries and vital supply dumps from the sky. Out on the ocean, the Navy deployed mind-bending dazzle painting, applying chaotic geometric patterns to ships like HMS Kildwick, completely confused enemy submarine rangefinders. Back in the trenches, the artists even manufactured macabre papier-mâché snipers' heads, raising these highly realistic decoys above the parapet to draw enemy fire and instantly expose the locations of hidden marksmen. The dawn of modern deception. So, what happens when you pull all these dark threads together? Think about the tribunals, the delicate silver masks, the redacted letters, and the hollow steel trees. In 1916, the British Empire proved a terrifying concept. Absolute power does not just come from the barrel of a gun or the blast of a heavy artillery shell. True power comes directly from the absolute total control of human perception. The state realized that to survive an unprecedented global conflict, it had to meticulously manage reality itself. We have extensively explored the four fundamental pillars of this highly managed reality. First, there was the deliberate legal erasure of the conscientious objector. The state built a vast bureaucratic machine to ensure anyone who refused to fight was immediately stripped of their voice and locked away, turning moral dissent into a completely invisible crime. Then, we witnessed the aesthetic hiding of the severely mutilated veteran. The brilliant reconstructive surgery and the painted metal masks were undeniable medical miracles, yet they served a darker political purpose. They shielded an anxious civilian public from looking directly at the gruesome consequences of their mechanized warfare. Third, there was the institutional falsification of battlefield casualty reports. The British Press Bureau constructed an impenetrable wall of censorship, burying the staggering death toll of the Somme under thick layers of sanitized official lies. They forced exhausted soldiers to permanently redact their own profound trauma from the fragile letters they sent home. Finally, we saw the brilliant tactical vanishing of the entire frontline military apparatus. Painters and engineers brilliantly transformed the shattered mud of the Western Front into a deadly optical illusion, proving that survival required blending seamlessly into the endless apocalypse. When you carefully synthesize these four distinct pillars, a truly startling revelation emerges about the nature of conflict. The defining characteristic of total war is not just mass societal mobilization or the sheer industrial scale of mechanized death. The true hallmark of total war is the deliberate, systemic obscuration of the raw human experience. The government deeply understood that if the civilian population could actually see the towering mountains of corpses, hear the desperate cries of the imprisoned objectors, or look upon the shattered faces of their returning sons, the entire war effort would crumble in a matter of days. To sustain the relentless meat grinder of the trenches, the state had to systematically blind its own loyal citizens to the immense suffering it was actively causing. This creates a profound and enduring paradox. The most critical components of the global war effort were the very things that remained completely unseen. The ultimate survival of the empire depended entirely on an intricate, carefully maintained web of illusions. The local tribunals acted as a heavy curtain to hide the psychological breaking of men who refused to kill. The specialized hospitals acted as a heavy curtain to hide the devastating destruction of human identity. The daily newspapers acted as a heavy curtain to hide the sheer bloody futility of the military strategy, and the woven camouflage netting acted as a literal curtain to hide the massive, churning engines of death. The real legacy of 1916 is not just the muddy ground won or lost at the Somme. It is not the subtle shifts in the complex trench lines or the names carved into endless stone memorials.